Hello, welcome to Unit 2, Methods of Research. In this video, we're going to look at the first subtopic of the unit, types of data, methods, and research design. So in future videos, we're going to look at approaches to sociological research and research issues. But within this video, we're going to look at primary and secondary data, as well as quantitative and qualitative data, and the strengths and limitations of each, as well as the differences. And we're going to end the video by looking at stages of research design. So as usual, before we get into the actual video, we're going to look at the main exam question from this unit. So that main question is, explain two strengths or two limitations or one strength and one limitation of, and then you would get a research method. So how you would answer this is you would make the point. So like one strength of this method is, or one limitation of this method is, and you name it. You get a mark for that. Just then you explain. So like this is because, and then you explain why. And then you have to explain why it is a strength or a limitation. So you would have to be, this is a strength because, or this is a limitation because. Like make it really obvious to the examiner that you're following the structure. And then you would repeat with the other strength or other limitation. So you would get a mark for each of these and 6 marks in total because you repeat twice. So also before we get started, I just wanted to clarify these two keywords because they lead to a lot of confusion between students. Reliable means consistency. So can the research method be repeated and the same results found? If that's the case, then it is a reliable research method. And validity means accuracy. So do the results represent what they say they're supposed to measure? Like, are they true? So yeah, I'm just going to use these throughout the video as you'll see. So I just wanted to clarify them. So moving on to primary data, that's information collected personally by the researcher. So the strengths are that because the researchers choose what research method to implement and how they implement it, they have greater control over validity and reliability. They also choose the sample of like people to choose from population. So they also have greater control over representativity. And they also obviously have control over what data is collected and for what purpose. So it's more likely to align with their research intentions, which is not the case in secondary data, as we'll see. The limitations are that it's obviously more time consuming because the researcher has to design, construct, and carry out the research method. Because of that reason, it's also more expensive, like they need to get funding. And sometimes it might be difficult for them to gain access to certain target groups. For example, like if they want to research a group in the past, they can't do that. Like they would need to use like secondary data like diaries, letters, newspapers, etc. So moving on to secondary data, that's information that already exists in some form. So usually it will be collected by other researchers, but it can also be like personal documents like diaries, newspapers, letters, as we've like mentioned before. So the strengths are that it obviously saves time, money, and effort for sociologists because they don't have to collect the data, they don't have to carry any research. In some situations, as we've seen, like in history, for example, it's the only available source they can use. It's also really useful for comparative and historical purposes. For comparative, especially like if you think about official statistics that are like carried out every year, you can really compare, for example, like marriage and divorce rates if they're falling or if they're rising, and that comparative study is something that can only really be done with secondary data. And they're also highly reliable and valid, especially with official statistics, because obviously within secondary data, there's like a lot of methods, as we'll see. Like we're going to discuss each one that you're supposed to know. But yeah, if official statistics are very reliable because they're repeated each year, and similar results will be found or trends will be found, and they're also very valid because they are done like they are designed to be valid, basically, and yes, they do get like the results that they're supposed to get. Also, when you think about like questionnaires and things like that, like they are designed to be valid. And limitations are that they might not align with researchers' intentions. That's because like they don't design the actual research, so data might be useful but not like exactly what they're looking for. And sometimes they can be unreliable and invalid as well. Like that's not so much the case with official statistics, but maybe with stuff like personal diaries or personal letters. Researchers might not be sure who wrote them, if it's representative of what everyone else at the time thought, if it's biased or not, etc. So quantitative data is data in numerical form, so either like a number, a percentage, or a rate. The strength is that it allows comparisons and correlations because the data is standardized and in numbers, like it's really easy to compare it. Whereas if you think, for example, like unstructured interview where like people respond really longly, it's really difficult to compare different answers because like two people might answer a question completely different. But if you think about like research methods that lead to quantitative data like numbers and that, it's very easy to compare because all the answers are going to be a number. um, so that also means it's very easy to test whether a hypothesis is true or false. It's also like really useful to track changes in the behavior of a group. It's also very easy to replicate because like you can compare so easily with numbers, and like you just have to like repeat the experiment, like giving the questionnaire, for example, again to like another set of people. So it's very reliable. And it's also easier for researchers to remain objective and valid because they don't really have contact with the people who they're like researching. They just, for example, would give a questionnaire, which already has like preset answers. The limitations are that sometimes it places respondents in artificial settings. So when that's the case, it can be argued that it's not valid because respondents, or the people that are being researched are not like in the natural world, so they're not acting as they usually would. And also, one of the main criticisms is that it lacks depth. So it might identify behaviors, but it doesn't explain them. So, on the other hand, qualitative data is non numeric information, and the strengths are that, unlike quantitative data, it does have depth and it does explain the why of people's behaviors, and it usually does tend to explore people in a more normal setting, so it's more valid. What I mean by normal setting, for example, is like if you think of interviews, so if you have like a standardized interview, like a closed question interview, like a really structured one, respondents are not allowed to answer freely as they usually would. They're only given like a pre-coded set of questions like that only have certain answers. That's kind of like an artificial setting. Whereas in an unstructured interview, which is much more like a conversation, that's more normal setting and respondents are allowed to like answer freely, and that actually leads to more valid data because they can actually say what they mean, whereas maybe in a structured interview they can't really respond what they want to respond, so they end up giving one of the choices of the answers that's there, so that's not valid because it's not actually like a real result. um, so the limitations would be that it usually focuses on small groups, so it's then less reliable and representative. It's less representative because it focuses on small groups that might not be representative, and it's less reliable because it's harder usually to repeat. Because as we said before, like in an interview, it would be really hard to compare answers that are not standardized. The depth of detail again makes it difficult to replicate. That was like the point we made previously, and it's also very difficult to compare groups over time and place because of the same reason. So moving on to like actually some research methods, we're going to start with official statistics. The strengths are that they're really useful for comparing behavior between time, so like the past and present, places like different countries and social groups like men, female, or like different ethnicities. They're very time saving, cheap, and easy to find. They're usually only like easily available online. Sometimes they might be the only data available, especially for stuff like marriages, divorces, deaths, births, things like that. Like the researcher wouldn't be able to know about unless they actually record to official statistics. Because they are usually like done with a really large sample, like most of the time it's like the whole population. They're really representative, and if they're hard statistics, which in the case of official statistics they are, then they are very accurate and valid. So hard statistics mean like basically those that are more likely to be accurate, such as like government statistics would be considered hard statistics. The limitations are that they don't have depth or detail, so they don't explain the why of behavior. Like they might say, like, oh, like they might indicate marriage is increasing, for example, but they don't actually explain why. There's also problems of validity, like what is excluded from published data. So, whilst the method is not exactly invalid, if the researchers don't publish all the results they find, which might be the case, then there would be problems of validity. And that would be mainly the case with governments. Like, that's in sociology, like the main example would be governments, for example, if they find something in official statistics that like looks bad on the country, for example, high levels of violence, they might not publish that or make it less to not make themselves look bad. They also must always be interpreted by researchers, again, because they don't actually explain the why. Researchers must come to that conclusion by themselves. So they might, if they have bias or they're subjective, then that might not be really valid. And then also some concepts might actually change, making comparisons really hard. For example, like poverty, how you measured poverty 50 years ago, whereas how you measure it now has changed. So if you look at the amount of people that were poor in the past, whereas the amount of poor that are now, like it might just be tricky to compare because like obviously that concept has changed. But that's just one example. It can happen with other concepts such as like social class, etc. So personal documents, these include stuff like diaries, newspapers, letters. The strengths are that they're also cheap and they also save time, effort, because again, they're like a secondary source of data. So that's the same thing with all of them. They can also be used for comparative purposes. And particularly with like personal, like individuals, like what individuals thought at the time and institutions. So like if a researcher in like investigates like documents from like governments and then compares them with like diaries from people who lived at the time, that can be like a really useful comparison. They also provide qualitative data of great depth and detail, so they would explain the why of behavior and like opinions of the time or the present if they're from the present. The limitations are that they're not always easy to find. The researcher doesn't always know by who or like why they were produced, so there can be problems with validity. And there's reliability problems if they're incomplete, inaccurate, or unrepresentative, which could be the case. So questionnaires are the strength would be that they are highly reliable because the same questions are asked each time, so they're really easy to be repeated and the same results found and compared. Validity can also be improved if respondents kept anonymous because then they're more likely to open up and say what they really think. There is also no Hawthorne effect if the researcher is not present. So the Hawthorne effect is when the researcher is present and respondents change the way they act or respond because they know they're being observed. And there's also no interviewer effect, which is when the like respondents try to please interviewers or researchers by giving answers they please. Obviously, that's the case if the questionnaire is given without the researcher present, which is usually the case. So you could talk about those. And then the limitations are that there's a really, really low response rate. So there's a risk of the sample self selecting itself. That means like the people that answer the questionnaire are already a certain type of people, for example, people who have more time or etc. And that would mean that it's only representative of that group of people who answered it. Whereas like if a lot of people like if everyone had answered it, then it would be representative of everyone. If that makes sense. This is actually a really tricky concept. Um, but yeah, it also lacks depth and detail again because it only identifies behavior, but it doesn't explain why of it. Some respondents might misunderstand a question, um, or like they might not have an option for their answer, and if there's not the researcher present who can answer those questions, they might leave questions in blank, which then would lead to reliability problems because not all answers can be compared. Um, or it can actually lead to validity problems if they answer wrongly, or if they choose an option that's not actually their answer because there's not another one, or if they misunderstand the question and answer another question. That would also lead to validity problems because the answers are not really being accurate. There's also problems that the researcher doesn't know who answered the questionnaire, which again leads to both validity problems and reliability problems. And there's also would be problems with leading questions. For example, like if the researcher kind of asks a question that is already leading to a certain answer, like you believe this, don't you? Like that already predisposes the people to agree with that. So those type of questions, which would have bias from the researcher, can also lead to validity problems. So next up we have some keywords. Yeah, before we get into interviews, I actually already mentioned interviewer effect, but this is also really two confusing terms because they're quite similar. But there's I just want to clarify them before I start using them with interviews. The interviewer effect is when the respondent tries to help researchers giving desired answers, which leads to invalid answers actually, and it's worse for the researcher. And the researcher effect is when like it's about status considerations, so like how gender, age, class, and ethnicity of respondent and researcher impacts the answers. So for example, like if you have a male interviewer, for example, and a female answerer, she might feel uncomfortable if he asks personal questions, and vice versa. Like if you have a female interviewer and a male respondent, if it's like really personal questions or sensitive topics, they might feel uncomfortable. But that's the same thing with like age. Like if you have an older person asking a younger person questions, or vice versa, or with class, or with ethnicity. Okay, so we're going to look at structured interviews. The strengths are that the researcher can answer questions because it's like he or she is there. So like basically because a structured interview is like a questionnaire being read out by the interviewer, right? So if the respondent has any questions, they can be answered, and there's not likely to be any questions left out. So it's more reliable because it can be repeated. The response rate will also be 100% because like the researcher will call each person, and if they say no, then they will find another person, whereas for like questionnaires they'll just be sent out and like some will not be returned. So in that way it is more it's like not on it's not unrepresentative. So basically it is representative. That's actually quite confusing put. The researcher also obviously knows who's answering. The limitations are the interviewer effect, like the respondent might try to help the researcher, providing answers designed to please. And the researcher effect can also happen, as we've already discussed, like status consideration. And it's also harder to build rapport. So rapport is like trust with the respondent, and that's really useful in interviews because like if you build trust, the respondent is more likely to open up, leading to more valid data because like they'll be honest about like their answers. But that's more the case in unstructured interviews, which feels more like a conversation. But if you have a person asking you like a questionnaire, like repeated questions with like only like certain answers, like the respondent is not likely to really feel comfortable with that, and there's not likely to be like any trust built. So that leads to like respondents usually not having the trust to open up that much. So laboratory experiments, the strengths are that like they can show correlations and causations between different variables. It can also be replicated easily because like the researcher can control conditions and variables in the same way it was in the first experiment, so it's very reliable. The limitations are that obviously it does place individuals in artificial settings, so you can argue that it's not the natural way they would act. So there's questions about validity. There's also two problems. There's either ethical issues if the researcher doesn't ask permission of the respondents, like if they want to participate in this. But then if they do ask that and there's no ethical issues, then there's a Hawthorne effect where participants are aware they're participating in a research and they might change their behavior. So one of them is always going to be an issue. Field experiments, the strengths are that they also show correlations between different variables, but they only show correlations, they don't show causation, because it's less easy to control all variables. So you can't really say this caused this, it's more likely like this is likely to cause this. It's in the real world, so it's more valid because like they respondents do act more natural. It's less difficult to repeat with the same. Actually, it's more difficult to repeat with the same conditions. Sorry, and variables, so it's less reliable because in the natural world, it's much harder to control every single variable. And again, there's either the Hawthorne effect or ethical issues over consent. Okay, so content analysis. It's really useful to identify themes and behavior and patterns of behaviors. Also, because researchers will use a standardized framework, it means that data can be replicated, so it's highly reliable. The limitations, however, are that the researcher has to make subjective conclusions, like what data means, what categories will be used to collect data, what behavior fits each category. Again, that's usually the case with like quantitative data because they will identify behavior but not explain it. In basically all those methods, the researcher will have to reach subjective conclusions, which can mean it's not really valid. Again, lack of depth, it doesn't explain how or why audiences perceive media, which actually leads to the reliability problems. Unstructured interviews, we've actually already discussed this throughout. So data is more likely to be accurate and valid because research, like respondents, are more likely to open up because there's rapport build up, like trust. Data is more likely to also have more depth and detail because they like encouraged to speak as freely as they can, and they end up like really just like going in depth and giving like long answers. And also researchers can't prejudge what makes important data. So like if researchers come with like a list of questions and possible answers, the conversation is not likely to go outside of what the researcher has planned. But in a free like conversation where like the respondent can carry the conversation wherever they want, it might lead to the conversation turning to areas of research that the researcher didn't even know about or didn't consider were that important in the research. And it might learn like they might actually think, oh, that's actually like a really good thing that I didn't think about, and ask further questions about those topics that maybe if they had a structured interview they wouldn't have ended up finding out about or considering for the research. The limitations are that it does require skill because like the researcher has to come up with questions on the spot, has to like not allow the conversation to go off topic, and like has to build trust with the respondent, etc. The researcher also kind of has little control of the conversation. So again, if it does go outside of topic, that might be a bit of a problem. It's also really time consuming because it's a longer interview. The answers are much longer, and the interviewer has to like prepare it, carry it out, and then transcribe it and then analyze it. So it takes a long time. Then there's the interview effect, and because it's also a non-standardized format, as we've discussed, it can't really be replicated, and the answers can't really be compared. So in a semi-structured interview where there's a mixture of like free conversation and pre-coded questions, data is more likely to be accurate and valid in those like free questions and deep and detailed. But it also, if it becomes irrelevant, the researcher can use a pre-prepared question, and those pre-prepared questions can be compared when it's repeated. So it has both validity and reliability. Like it really combines the strength of both, like unstructured and structured interviews. Again, the researcher can't prejudge what makes important data because there is a part of the interview where the respondent can talk freely and they can build a strong rapport. The limitations are that it requires skill, like to combine the two methods, like know when to like let the respondent talk freely, when to ask the pre-coded questions, and like build rapport. The same thing again. Time consuming because of the same reasons. Interview effect. In the questions that are non-standardized, they can't be replicated. But again, you can. This is not really a limitation because you can argue like it does balance out both. And pre-prepared questions might be leading or biased. Yeah, like we discussed with like structured interviews. So group interviews are carried out in a group, and their strength are that like researchers can help and control conversation. Like they are allowed to do that, whereas like in interviews are usually not encouraged. Like for example, in unstructured interviews, they're not encouraged to control conversation or help. They can control the pace and extent of the conversation, the schedule. They can ask questions, change focus, or stop discussions. Like that's all allowed. It's also a situation that reflects how people naturally share and discuss ideas. Like we don't, people don't like develop opinions on their own, but like after talking and discussing things with people and sharing ideas. So it reflects how that happens naturally. It does require a lot of skill because like there's a lot of people. You want to make sure everyone's speaking. You want to make sure you're asking the right questions at the right time, letting them speak when they should be speaking. And then it also there's problems with representativeness. Like you have to choose a group that really represents society, or at least the group that you're trying to research. There's also the interview effect known as groupthink, where people might find the pressure to like agree with their group and rather than expressing their own opinions. Like if they think they're going to be on their own, that they might not like express their own opinions. And group consensus, which is like when they try to like give a like all agree on a answer that they think the researcher is going to like, and not actually express their own opinions. They're quite similar. So then there's overt participant observation, which is when like the researcher goes to study a group and participates in the group, but they make their presence known as a like a researcher. So the strength are that they can ask questions, take notes, observe behavior openly, so it's more valid. Like in a covert participant observation, like researchers may have to like rely on memory after the research takes place because they can't take notes without looking suspicious, and they can't ask questions. So that actually, like we all know, memory is not that reliable. And if they don't ask questions and misunderstand the behavior, both of those things would make the research less valid. They witness an experience that people say they do, so that's actually really, in a way, does make the research valid in that sense. There's less risk of involvement in unethical, criminal, dangerous, or destructive behavior because you can just stand apart and be like, oh, like I'm not going to participate in this, and it doesn't look suspicious because they already know that that person is a researcher. And there's also the term Verstehen, which is introduced by Weber, so you would have to reference him if using it. And it's that the researcher understands by experiencing, so that leads to like a really, really good understanding, a really in-depth understanding. The limitations is that if a group refuses permission to be observed, then they can't be observed. There's the observer, the Hawthorne effect. There's a risk that the researcher will become the story, so like too involved and like eventually join the group. And if they continue their research, that would lead to the research being completely biased. And if they end up joining that group, then it's also dangerous for them. Like the research caused that. So then it's kind of like a really risky research method for the researcher. And also, it's impossible to replicate exactly the same thing because there's no structure to it. Like, the researcher just goes there and observes. So, covered participant observation may be the only way to study people who don't want to be studied because you are hidden, like they don't know they're being studied. And this would usually be the case, for example, with gangs, criminal groups, etc. It also avoids the observer effect, like the Hawthorne effect, because like they don't know they're being researched, they'll act more naturally, and that leads to more valid data. It's also like it provides really deep and detailed data. That's actually also like overt participant observation, like both. And again, sorry, it has Verstehen, which is like understanding by experiencing. The limitations are that it's really hard to get in, stay in, and get out. That's because, like, to get in, some groups might need invitation or some characteristics. Staying in is hard because, like, the researcher has to like not be suspicious. Like, they can't ask questions, they can't take notes. They have to have like a backstory. And getting out, of course, they need a valid excuse that doesn't look suspicious again. Again, there's a risk that the researcher will become the story. The research can't be replicated. Everyone has to trust that the researcher saw what they saw, and recording data is very difficult. And they have to rely on memory, which might not be always very reliable and valid. So, onto non participant observation. The strengths are that, like, ethical issue might not always be an issue because, like, since they're observing people from the distance, they're not even participating, they're not entering the group. Um, they might not even need permission to observe. For example, like if they're observing like a match or a play or something that like is already open to the public or people in the street, that might not really, you can't really ask permission for that, so it's not an issue. However, um, because there, that's actually a limitation. I'm moving on to the limitation, but just to make it more clear, because they're still researching people without their permission, it might still be ethically wrong. So it depends, of course, how it's done. So you can either measure it as a strength or limitation, but you would have to argue why to make it a valid claim. But for example, if they persistently observe a group of people in the street, like that might be really ethically wrong. Well, other strengths are that it does allow to research on people who might not want to be studied. However unethical that is, it's still a strength. Also, respondents can be studied in a natural setting, so it's more valid. And researchers can take notes and record data most of the case because they're in a distance. The limitations, again, with like most observation, I think all of them, it cannot be replicated, so it's not really reliable. Observing people from a distance may fail to produce data with depth, and again, the ethical issues, which we already discussed. So before we move on to like stages of research, I just want to share some tips for strengths and limitations that I used. So the main one I would say is like know the methods very well. So now I've straight gone to talk about like strengths and limitations, but do study the methods and how they work and how they are carried out because once you know them, you know like the limitations and strengths for quantitative and qualitative and primary and secondary data, basically those four that we just talked about in the beginning, you can really come up with the strengths and limitations yourself. So I don't think I really had to memorize each strengths and limitations of each method, but just like knowing in general what like some strengths and limitations from some methods and then knowing the methods really well, you can quickly come up with them yourself. So I would say instead of memorizing them, just really understand the methods really well and really understand the strengths and limitations of a couple, especially like the general universal ones of like secondary, primary data and qualitative and quantitative data, because that's my biggest tip in an exam. If you don't know, if you can't come up with any strengths and limitations, just think, okay, is this method they're asking me primary or secondary source of data and qualitative and quantitative data, and then you can find strengths of those that apply to your method, and then if you explain it because you know the method really well, you can explain how it has that strength or limitation and why it's a limitation or a strength, then you already get the marks. However, I will also say always try to find strengths and limitations that are specific to your method and not really universal ones. As long as you explain and you explain why it's a limitation or strength, it wouldn't be an issue. But don't try to say like it's time consuming, it's expensive or cheap, or it's easy available or not, because those, for example, are very universal. So try to find ones really specific to the method. So yeah, I would eventually recommend learning the ones specific to the method, but just you can really, if you understand the methods really well, come up with those. it's really straightforward once you, because I know a lot of people struggle with this unit. Like it's one of the units that everyone hates in sociology, at least the students that I know. So I know lots of people like just don't want to learn the strengths and limitations, but it's actually really, really easy when you actually know the research methods really well. Okay, so stages of research. These are according to Oberg, so you would have to reference him if discussing these. But basically, the first stage is planning. So what to research and how, and either you formulate a research question or hypotheses. So hypotheses is usually for those who prefer quantitative data, and a research question would be for those who prefer qualitative data. The second step is information gathering. So like the researcher would have to find a sample to study and then a pilot study. So like they would also have to choose a research method, and then the sampling method. And then what they would usually do is actually a pilot study. So that's like a small scale study to test both of them. So if that works, they move on to information processing, where they carry the research, like with the sample study and the research method, in a large scale, like the full scale they want to do. And it also involves analyzing and interpreting data. The last stage is evaluation. So there's two evaluations. Internal is like the researchers themselves assess how the research was carried out. And then external, like they reach conclusions and publish them, and then people and other researchers are allowed to also assess how that research was done as a whole and publish criticism or evaluation. And that can be positive or negative. And lastly, we're going to look at sampling methods. So you really do have to know them, because I didn't put the exam question here, but you would typically be just like asked to like describe a research method, one or two, in that question, but not always. So random sampling is when everyone in the target population of the research has an equal chance of being selected. It's almost like the lottery. Like sometimes even like names are pulled out, or sometimes computers will do it, but it's random. Like everyone has a chance of being selected and an equal chance. Then there's systematic sampling, which is when researchers select members of the population, like their target population, they want at a regular interval. For example, they'll be like, okay, so every 15th name on this list will be selected, or every 50th name on this list. So like they have like a regular interval, like a numerical regular interval. Stratified random sampling is when the target population is divided by characteristics first. So the like researchers will select like a target population, but then for example divide groups into like male and female, and then within those groups carry out random sampling and select like 20 people from each. But that's usually done when researchers want to have a representative sample, because if you do like random sampling itself, you might end up, because it's random, with like I don't know 60% female and 40% men. But if you want the research to have equal number, but that can be the same with social class, with age, etc. Like you would divide first into those characteristics and then do random sampling within each. Then snowball sampling is when someone is the target population is chosen, like the type of person that the researcher wants to research, and then they suggest others who might also fit the research. And then finally, there's non-representative sampling, which is when the researcher just focuses on a single group. And this is mostly the case in like observation, for example, like if they just want to investigate this certain gang, they would just select them. Like it's not representative of all gangs, it's not representative of all population, but the researcher is not interested in it being representative. Sometimes they just want to focus on a single group. And before we end, I just want to discuss some keywords in research methods. Operationalization is converting a concept such as social class into something that can be researched and measured. We broadly, very vaguely mentioned this before. Like some concepts might change or are really easy, like hard to define, so it's really tricky to like research over time. So in that case, the researcher would have to carry out operationalization, which is decide how that will be measured. Pilot study is the mini version of a full scale study to test its feasibility, as we've said before. And then generalizability is when the results of the target population can be applied to the population as a whole because it's representative. And that's actually a really big strength. So when you talk about like a method being representative and you have to explain like why that's a strength, you would say this is a strength because it can be generalized to the whole population. Like that's a really, really good strength. And that's the end of this lesson. I hope you found it useful, and please like and subscribe and share with any classmates or friends who you might think might find this useful as well. Thank you for watching. Bye.